It was an ordinary afternoon when the world as they knew it began to unravel. The Walker family, Father Greg, Mother Sarah, and their two children, 16-year-old Emily and 9-year-old Ben, were all scattered throughout the house. Greg was in the garage, tuning up the car after a long week of work. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing a late lunch. Emily was on the phone with her best friend, discussing an upcoming school event, while Ben was playing video games in the living room. The television in the living room, left on in the background, suddenly flashed with an emergency broadcast. The voice on the other end was strained, anxious, as the screen displayed a breaking news alert. Sarah turned her attention to the living room TV, her hands frozen in the middle of chopping vegetables. Severe incidents of violent attacks reported across the country, unconfirmed reports of a virus, citizens urged to stay indoors. Her heartbeat quickened, but she dismissed it as another one of those exaggerated reports. "Greg!" she called out. "Come in here. You need to hear this." Greg stepped inside from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. He raised an eyebrow at Sarah. "What's going on?" Sarah pointed at the TV, and they both watched in silence as the voice continued its warning. "Do not attempt to leave your homes." Just as they processed the gravity of the situation, there was a knock at the front door. Ben, still glued to his video game, hardly noticed, but Emily's face went pale. "Who's at the door?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The knocking continued, louder this time, more insistent. Greg exchanged a glance with Sarah. They weren't expecting anyone. "Stay here," Greg said, his voice low and steady. He moved toward the door with caution, glancing through the peephole. The figure on the other side was a stranger, an older man with graying hair, his face twisted in desperation. He was panting, his clothes torn as though he'd been running. His hands were trembling, and his eyes were wide, filled with panic. "Please!" the man shouted, voice cracked. "Let me in. They're coming." Before Greg could respond, there was a loud crash from the street, followed by a chorus of screams. He didn't need to look outside to know something was terribly wrong. A sudden surge of primal fear hit him, but he didn't let it show. "Stay inside," Greg said firmly, not opening the door. He glanced back at his family, who had gathered anxiously in the hallway. The man continued to beg, now frantically pounding on the door, but Greg's instincts screamed at him to keep his family safe, and he turned away. "We can't risk it," he said, voice trembling slightly. Sarah walked over to the window, her heart in her throat. She peered through the blinds, seeing the chaos outside. The streets, once quiet and suburban, were now filled with screams, and people were running, some were stumbling, others falling to the ground, seemingly attacked by something. "Are we safe?" Emily asked, her voice edged with fear. Greg looked at his family. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. His first instinct was to barricade the house, lock the doors, and never open them again. But what if this was just a temporary panic? What if the news reports were wrong? "Greg?" Sarah's voice pulled him back. "What do we do?" "We stay inside," Greg replied, his voice gaining strength. "No matter what happens, we stay inside. If they're telling people to stay indoors, then that's the safest place right now." Just then, there was a loud thud on the window, followed by a series of sharp, unnatural sounds. Greg rushed to the window and gasped in horror. Several figures were shuffling down the street, moving erratically. They weren't walking. They were stumbling, groaning. Some had blood on their clothes, while others were dragging themselves along, their eyes glazed over. "Dad!" Ben cried, running into the kitchen, his face pale with terror. "What's happening?" "It's all right, Ben," Greg said, trying to steady his breathing. "It's all right." But inside, he was anything but calm. Panic was beginning to set in, and the only thing he could focus on was the safety of his family. He closed the blinds and turned the deadbolt on the door, locking them all inside. It was too late for anyone to come for help, and too dangerous for anyone to go out. They were trapped. As the minutes ticked by, the once quiet and peaceful neighborhood had descended into chaos. From every direction, the sounds of distant cries, crashes, and gunshots filled the air. The peaceful suburb had transformed into a battleground, and the Walker family was now a part of it. The news broadcast continued, but the message had changed. "This is no longer a national emergency," the voice crackled over the airwaves. "This is an outbreak. A pandemic. Authorities have lost control. Do not trust anyone. Do not open your doors." Greg's heart sank. The world was collapsing outside, and the family was locked inside, with no way to escape. "Get to the basement," Greg said, his voice shaking. "Now." As they hurried to the basement door, Greg caught one last glimpse of the outside world, an eerie, silent wasteland. The only thing left was a world overrun by chaos, and they had no choice but to survive. The basement was the only place left where they might find some semblance of safety. Greg quickly ushered his family down the narrow stairs, the echo of each step sending a chill through his spine. The air in the basement was musty and thick, filled with the scent of old boxes and forgotten memories. The Walker family huddled together in the dim light of the lone bulb hanging from the ceiling. "Why are we down here?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted toward the narrow window above the stairs, but she could see nothing except a darkened world outside. "Because it's the safest place," Greg said, forcing his voice to remain steady even as panic gnawed at his insides. "We need to stay low, stay quiet, and wait this out." Sarah, holding Ben's hand tightly, cast a worried look toward the stairs. "What if they come here? What if they find us?" Greg didn't have an answer. There was no easy way to explain the horrors that were unfolding outside. No way to make her feel safe, not with the unknown terror lurking just beyond their door. Outside, the chaos was escalating. The shuffling footsteps and muffled groans from the street echoed down the walls of the house. Greg knew that those things, those monsters, were getting closer. The news had warned them, but they had never imagined anything could be this bad. "Why are they doing this?" Emily whispered, the question hanging in the air like a weight. "I don't know," Greg replied. "But whatever it is, we can't let it come inside. We have to stay here and wait for help." "How long?" Sarah asked, her face pale in the dim light. Greg could only shake his head. The truth was, he didn't know if help was coming. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the world outside had probably already fallen apart. This wasn't just a temporary disaster, it was something worse. It was the end of the world as they knew it. Ben tugged on Greg's sleeve, his face scrunched with confusion and fear. "Dad, what's happening? Where are the police? Where's the army?" Greg bent down to meet his son's eyes, doing his best to mask the fear in his own. "They're probably trying to stop it too, Ben. But we can't depend on them. We have to be strong. For each other." Ben nodded, though his fear didn't lessen. He clung to his father's side, his small hand gripping Greg's shirt like a lifeline. Sarah sat on an old wooden crate, her eyes wide with anxiety. "We need to barricade the house. If we're staying here, we can't just sit around and hope nothing gets through." Greg's mind raced. "You're right," he said. "We'll need to secure all the doors and windows. We can't afford any weaknesses." They moved quickly, going over the plan to fortify their position. Greg moved upstairs, scanning the house for any weaknesses. He placed a heavy dresser in front of the front door, wedged chairs, and a table in front of the windows, anything to slow down the inevitable. Meanwhile, Sarah checked the kitchen and pantry, taking stock of their supplies. Water, canned goods, and anything that could be used as a weapon if the need arose. It was hard to focus. Each noise from outside made their hearts skip a beat, and every soft shuffle against the walls made them freeze in terror. The world outside was descending into madness, and there was no guarantee that the barricades would hold. "Dad," Emily called from upstairs. "There's something out there." Greg's heart stopped. He rushed up the stairs, motioning for Sarah and Ben to stay in the basement. Reaching the top of the stairs, he quietly approached the front window, the wooden blinds still drawn. Through a crack in the blinds, Greg could make out dark shapes in the distance. They were close, too close. A group of the grotesque creatures, now unmistakable with their bloodied faces and twisted bodies, were slowly making their way down the street. They were moving erratically, and their hands reached out like clawed appendages. One of them, an older man with sunken eyes and pale, mottled skin, shuffled toward the house. He paused for a moment, staring at the door as though he could sense their presence behind it. Greg held his breath, praying the old man would move on. But the figure's head snapped to the side, and Greg's stomach dropped. The creature sniffed the air, its tongue flicking out like a snake's, tasting the air for any sign of life. The older man's eyes locked onto the window. Greg's heart pounded in his chest. He quickly backed away from the window, his mind racing. He needed to get back to his family. They weren't safe here. "Sarah." Greg called down the stairs, his voice low but urgent. "We need to get to the basement, now." His legs felt like they were made of lead as he moved back toward the basement door. The house had become a death trap, and they were running out of time. The sounds from outside grew louder. The groaning of the creatures was now joined by the distinct sound of glass shattering. Something, had breached one of the windows. And as Greg descended into the basement, locking the door behind him, he knew the worst part of the nightmare was about to begin. They were no longer safe in their own home. The sound of breaking glass still echoed in Greg's mind as he descended into the basement with his family. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud, the heavy lock clicking into place, but the sudden silence that followed was almost worse. It was the calm before the storm, the terrifying realization that they were running out of time and options. Sarah, her face pale and streaked with sweat, was already making her way to the far corner of the basement. She began rummaging through boxes, pulling out old blankets and canned goods. Ben clung to her side, trembling, his small fingers digging into her arm as though afraid to let go. Emily, standing close to Greg, stared at the basement door with wide, haunted eyes. "Do you think they'll find us?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Greg didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure. He couldn't be sure of anything anymore. He glanced at the basement windows, small and narrow, reinforced with metal bars. They were a decent barrier, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a cage. "We'll be fine," he lied, his voice rough. "We just need to stay quiet and wait." But even as he said it, he knew they were running out of time. The sound of movement above them sent a cold shiver down his spine. It wasn't the wind or a passing car, it was something heavier, something that didn't belong. A muffled thud, followed by the soft scraping of something, or someone, dragging across the floor. Greg's eyes flicked to the basement door. His hand instinctively went to the pocketknife tucked into his belt. Every sound, every creak of the house felt like a warning. "Stay down," Greg ordered, his voice hardening. "We can't afford to make a sound." Emily, Ben, and Sarah all nodded, each of them visibly shaken. They huddled together in the darkest corner of the basement, doing their best to keep quiet. The weight of their breath in the stifling air was the loudest sound in the room. Above them, the footsteps grew closer, echoing in the empty house like a death march. Greg's pulse quickened. Whatever had broken into the house wasn't human. It couldn't be. The strange shuffling noises, the low groans, it was a nightmare unfolding right before their eyes. The house creaked under the weight of whatever was moving above. Then came another thud. A crash. Something was being knocked over upstairs, a loud, bone-chilling sound that made the family flinch. Greg moved to the bottom of the stairs, his hand resting on the handle of the kitchen knife he'd grabbed earlier. He had no illusions about what needed to be done if the creatures made it downstairs. There was no choice but to fight. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Greg's mind raced as he tried to process everything that had happened so far. The news reports had said this was a virus, that it spread quickly, that the infected were driven by hunger, a hunger for human flesh. He had heard stories of zombie outbreaks before, of course, movies, books, the usual apocalyptic scenarios. But none of that prepared him for this. The horror of seeing the world fall apart so suddenly was more than any of them could comprehend. A loud, rasping breath filtered down from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scratching at the walls. The basement door trembled slightly as if something was pressing against it. Greg felt a shudder ripple through his body. They had to be ready. "Mom, Dad." Ben's voice broke through the thick air, quiet but terrified. Greg knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's okay, Ben," he whispered, his voice as steady as he could make it. "We just have to stay calm. We're going to get through this. We're going to be okay." But deep down, Greg wasn't sure if he believed it. The house, their refuge, was no longer safe. Whatever had breached their defenses upstairs wasn't human anymore. It was something else. Something monstrous. The groaning above them grew louder, more pronounced. Something was moving in the hallway. It was getting closer. Then, a sharp, shrill noise rang through the house, something metal scraping against metal, and the basement door buckled. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was enough to make everyone freeze in fear. Greg stood up and moved to the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his chest, the adrenaline racing through his veins. Whatever it was coming. The time for hiding was over. "Get ready," Greg said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, wide-eyed and pale, pulled Ben closer to her. Emily, though terrified, stood at the ready, her hands shaking as she clutched a metal rod she had picked up from the basement floor. The scraping sound continued, louder now, closer to the door. The Walker family braced themselves for what was coming. No longer were they the hunted, they were the hunters. The cold steel of their makeshift weapons felt foreign in their hands, but it was all they had. Then, the door cracked open, just enough to reveal the dark silhouette of an infected creature, a grotesque, bloodied figure dragging itself toward them. Its vacant eyes were hollow, its mouth dripping with saliva as it let out a low, guttural growl. The fight for survival had begun. The infected figure at the top of the basement stairs groaned, its head jerking unnaturally as it peered into the dim light. The smell of decay filled the basement, overpowering the musty scent of old boxes and unused furniture. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as he tightened his grip on the kitchen knife, its blade cold in his hand. The creature didn't move at first, just stood there, swaying slightly as it stared into the darkness, its hollow, vacant eyes glinting in the faint light. It was as if it was listening for any sign of life, any movement that might betray the presence of the family hiding below. Greg motioned for his family to stay back. He didn't want to risk making any noise, but they all understood. The creature's presence was more than just a threat, it was a ticking time bomb. They needed to act before it was too late. A faint, almost imperceptible creak echoed through the house as the thing shifted its weight, inching closer to the basement stairs. Greg's breath hitched in his throat, but he forced himself to stay still, praying that the infected creature wouldn't sense their presence. But then it made its move. With a sudden, violent lunge, the creature threw itself toward the basement door, its clawed hands scraping the wood. The impact shook the house, and the Walker family flinched at the sound, but Greg didn't hesitate. He shot to his feet, the knife ready in his hand. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice strained with urgency. Ben whimpered softly, burying his face in his mother's arms. Sarah held him tight, trying to keep him as quiet as possible. Emily's hand tightened around the metal rod she had grabbed earlier, her knuckles white. Despite her fear, there was a spark of resolve in her eyes. She was ready to fight for survival. The creature's moans grew louder, more desperate, as it clawed at the door, its nails screeching against the wood. With a sudden violent push, the infected creature threw its weight against the door. The hinges creaked in protest. It was going to break through. Greg moved without thinking, his instincts taking over. He lunged toward the basement door and shoved the dresser even harder into place, attempting to barricade it further. The creature, now fully aware of their presence, began to slam its fists against the door. The force of its blows made the entire house tremble. Greg glanced over his shoulder at his family, his heart sinking. They were cornered. The basement was their last line of defense, and if this door fell, there would be no escape. The infected creature began to howl. The sound was chilling, like a cross between a growl and a human scream, as it twisted its body, attempting to push its way through the small opening. It was relentless, its strength terrifying as it pounded on the door, each strike a grim reminder of what awaited them if it broke through. "Greg, what do we do?" Sarah's voice cracked, her eyes wide with fear. His mind raced. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They couldn't wait for rescue, it was unlikely any help would come. Every second they wasted was another moment the infected could breach their defenses. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. Greg's eyes flicked around the basement, scanning for anything they could use to their advantage. He spotted a small wooden table in the corner, old, with a broken leg, and a pile of scrap metal near the furnace. He grabbed the metal scrap, inspecting the pieces, but there was nothing that would give them much of an advantage. "We need to fight back," Greg said, his voice hardening. "If it breaks through, we're done." Emily looked up, her eyes wide but determined. "What if we don't open the door? What if we can just wait until it goes away?" Greg shook his head. "We don't know how many there are, and if one's here, there could be more. We can't wait. If they're already inside the house, we have to clear them out before they find us." He turned toward the basement door, where the infected creature continued to hammer away, its nails screeching on the wood. Greg swallowed hard. There was no turning back now. "Emily, Ben," Greg called, "I need you both to stay close to your mom and stay low. We can't take any chances. I'll handle this." Ben whimpered but nodded, his face pale with fear. Emily's face, too, was etched with fear, but there was no backing down. She wasn't going to let the creature win. The pounding on the basement door intensified, and Greg's mind snapped into survival mode. His instincts told him to be quick, strike hard and fast. "Mom," Greg said, his voice low, "we need to get the kids to the back of the basement. Keep them there. I'll take care of this." Sarah didn't argue. She took Ben's hand and motioned for Emily to follow her. They both moved to the farthest corner of the basement, huddling against the wall. The door was shaking violently now. The infected thing was close, too close. Greg gripped the kitchen knife with both hands, his fingers slick with sweat. He swallowed the lump in his throat. There was no turning back. The world outside had fallen apart, and there was no place left to run. Another bone-crushing thud hit the door, and it groaned, the wood starting to crack under the pressure. Greg could hear the creature's ragged breathing on the other side. It was so close now. Too close. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as he took his position near the door. He had no choice but to face the nightmare head-on. The door creaked again, and then with a final, earth-shaking crash, the infected creature broke through. It was time to fight for their lives. The moment the door splintered, Greg sprang forward, the knife raised high. The creature let out an ear-splitting screech, its twisted mouth gaping open as it lunged at him. But Greg was ready. The first strike was quick, slicing across the creature's arm, causing it to stagger back. But it didn't stop. It lunged again, claws outstretched. Greg ducked, narrowly missing its grasp, and slammed the blade into its chest with all the strength he could muster. The fight for survival was no longer a question. It was a desperate battle, one that would determine if they made it through the night. The infected creature let out a low, guttural growl as Greg's knife buried itself deep into its chest. The impact sent a shock of cold terror through his body. It felt like stabbing a brick wall, but the creature staggered back with a painful screech, clutching at the deep wound. Blood, black, oily, and thick, oozed from the wound as the thing let out a horrifying cry, the sound vibrating through Greg's bones. It wasn't enough to stop it. The infected creature lunged again, more frenzied this time, its claws slashing at the air. Greg's heart raced as he barely dodged, the creature's nails grazing his shoulder. Pain seared through him, but there was no time to dwell on it. He needed to finish this, fast. "Stay back!" Greg shouted, his voice strained as he tightened his grip on the kitchen knife, now slick with the creature's foul blood. He aimed for its head, but the creature twisted its body, evading the blow. Emily gasped from the corner, and Greg's eyes flicked toward her for just a split second. That was all the time the infected needed. It barreled toward him, faster than Greg had anticipated. Before he could react, its claws slashed across his chest, raking open his jacket and drawing blood. The pain exploded through him, but Greg gritted his teeth and surged forward, stabbing the knife deep into the creature's throat. This time, the creature didn't move. It gurgled, the sound wet and choking, as the life drained from its bloodshot eyes. Finally, it collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud, motionless. Greg stood over the thing's body, chest heaving with shallow breaths. His heart pounded in his ears, the adrenaline still surging through him. He wiped the blood from his hands onto his pants, his body trembling as the reality of what had just happened settled in. He was alive. They were alive. But for how much longer? "Are you okay?" Sarah's voice trembled from behind him. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she tried to mask it for the sake of Ben and Emily. She moved toward Greg slowly, her hands instinctively reaching for him, checking for any injuries. "I'm fine," Greg managed to say, though the sharp pain in his chest told a different story. He had no time to dwell on it. "We have to move." He turned back to the basement door. The fight had drawn the attention of more of them. He could hear the guttural moans echoing from the hallway above. The house was no longer a sanctuary. They were under siege. "Emily, Ben, get to the back of the basement," Greg barked, his voice low but commanding. "Stay behind the crates. Don't move unless I say so." His children hesitated, their faces painted with fear, but they did as he told them, running quickly to the far corner of the basement. Emily grabbed Ben's hand, pulling him behind the crates where they huddled together, shaking. Sarah followed Greg's gaze, her own eyes scanning the house. "What now?" "We need to fortify this basement. We need to make sure they can't get in," Greg replied, his voice tight. His mind was already working overtime, calculating every possible move. They couldn't afford to wait. The longer they stayed in one place, the more vulnerable they became. The sound of footsteps above them grew louder. The creatures were swarming through the house, their numbers increasing with every passing moment. They had breached the front door. There was no way to stop them now. "Greg," Sarah said quietly, stepping closer to him. She glanced nervously at the stairs. "What if we can't hold them off? What if we can't make it through the night?" Greg's mind flashed to the moment when he first saw the infected on the street, when he thought it was just a nightmare. Now, that nightmare was their reality. Every instinct told him that they had to get out, but where would they go? The world outside had turned into a wasteland. The streets were crawling with the infected, and there was no guarantee they would find any safety, even if they managed to escape. "I won't let them get us," Greg said, his voice quiet but resolute. "We fight. We survive." His eyes locked with Sarah's, and she nodded, though her face remained filled with concern. She was scared, terrified, but she wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when their family was still together. But even as Greg spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The infected were getting closer. The house, once a home, now felt like a tomb, and it wouldn't be long before they found their way inside. The basement windows were too small to escape through, and the door was a flimsy barrier at best. They had no choice but to fight. But as Greg moved back to the corner of the basement to grab anything they could use as a weapon, he heard a new sound, a different kind of movement. This time, it wasn't coming from above. It came from behind. Greg froze, his blood running cold as he turned to face the source of the sound. There, standing in the shadowy corner of the basement, was another figure, a person. Someone who wasn't one of them. It was a man, bloodied and dirty, his clothes torn. His face was pale, streaked with sweat and grime, and his eyes were wild with panic. he was one of the survivors. But the question was, could they trust him? The man raised his hands slowly, a gesture of peace, but Greg didn't lower his guard. If the infected were starting to infiltrate the house, there was no telling who this person was or whether they would be a help or a hindrance. "What do you want?" Greg demanded, his voice steady despite the surge of dread inside him. The man's eyes darted to the stairs, then back to Greg. "Please," he rasped, "you have to help me. They're coming for us. We can't stay here. We have to leave. Now." The reality of their situation was clear now. The house was no longer their safe haven. It had become a death trap. And the only way out was to face the nightmare head-on. Greg's mind raced, his heart pounding as he studied the stranger standing before him. The man's eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them, desperation, a kind of raw panic that sent a chill through Greg. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. In a world where death lurked around every corner, there were no guarantees. The man took a step forward, his clothes torn and stained with blood. He appeared to be in his early 30s, though it was hard to tell with the dirt and grime caked across his face. His chest rose and fell rapidly, as though he had been running for his life. And maybe he had. "Please," the man rasped again, his voice hoarse from either exhaustion or fear. "You don't understand. They're coming. You have to let me in. I can help you." Greg didn't lower the knife in his hand. His eyes flicked to Sarah and then to the kids, who were still huddled in the back corner of the basement, staring at the stranger with wide, frightened eyes. Emily's grip tightened around the metal rod she'd been holding since the fight upstairs, her knuckles white. "I don't know you," Greg said, his voice steady but laced with distrust. "How do we know you're not one of them?" The stranger's eyes flicked toward the stairs nervously, his movements jerky, as if he were constantly watching for any sign of danger. He wiped the back of his hand across his brow, smearing the sweat and grime. "I'm not infected. I'm one of the last survivors. I saw them, the things that are killing people. They're all over the neighborhood. You can't stay here. You're all gonna be dead if you do." Greg felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The stranger's words rang too true. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a death trap. He needed to make a decision. Every moment they waited could be their last. But the fear and distrust in Greg's heart wouldn't let him lower his guard. People could be infected without showing symptoms. What if this man was hiding the truth, leading them into a trap? "We're not just gonna let anyone in," Greg said, his tone harsh. "How do we know you're not infected?" The man's hands trembled as he placed them on his head, running his fingers through his hair in frustration. "Look," he said, his voice starting to break. "I can't explain everything right now. I don't have time. There's a group of them, and they've already breached the street. You need to leave, now. I can get you out of here. I know the way. We can find shelter. There's a place." Suddenly, there was a loud crash from upstairs. The sound of furniture being torn apart, followed by the unmistakable growl of the infected, echoed through the house. The creatures had broken through. Greg's heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, he took a step closer to the stranger. "What's that sound?" The man froze, his eyes wide with terror. He glanced back toward the stairs, his body tense with panic. "They found us," he said in a whisper, his voice barely audible. Greg's blood ran cold. He could hear the shuffling of feet above, the low growls of the creatures getting closer. He was running out of time. "Look, we don't have a choice," Greg said, his voice tight with urgency. He turned to Sarah. "Sarah, get the kids. We need to move. Now." Sarah's face was pale, her eyes flicking back and forth between Greg and the stranger, uncertainty clouding her gaze. But there was no time to argue. She grabbed Ben's hand and motioned for Emily to follow her. The children looked terrified, but they moved quickly toward the far corner, staying as low to the ground as possible. The stranger stepped closer, his voice desperate. "I swear to you, I'm not one of them. I just want to get out of here. I need to get out of here too. Greg hesitated for a moment longer, his mind battling with the decision. But the growling from upstairs grew louder. He could hear the unmistakable sound of the infected approaching the basement stairs. Fine, Greg said, his voice low but resolute. But if you try anything. The man raised his hands in surrender, his face twisted with fear. I won't. I promise. Greg motioned for him to follow. The family huddled together in the corner of the basement, fear in their eyes as they prepared to make their next move. Greg's mind raced as he thought about their options. The basement was their only defense, but it wouldn't hold for long. We need to barricade the basement door, Greg said, his voice urgent. We'll use the table and anything else we can find. If they get in, we fight. Emily, still gripping the metal rod tightly, nodded silently, her eyes darting to the stairs. The stranger, who had been standing at the edge of the group, now knelt down beside them, his eyes scanning the basement with a quick, nervous glance. He seemed to be calculating their options, too. I can help, the stranger said, his voice pleading. I've seen how they move, how they think. I know how to get us out of here. Greg looked at him, unsure whether he could trust the man's words. But they had no other choice. The infected would be at the door any moment. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. All right, Greg said, turning his attention back to the barricade. Help us block the door. If you know a way out, then we'll listen. But you don't get to lead us. You follow my orders. The stranger nodded eagerly. His hands were trembling as he helped them push the heavy table against the door. The basement door groaned under the pressure, but it held for the moment. Outside, the infected were closing in. The noises from upstairs grew louder, and Greg's heart thudded painfully in his chest. Time was running out. When the barricade was finally in place, the family gathered in the far corner of the basement, as far from the door as possible. Emily's grip on the metal rod tightened, her face pale but determined. Ben clung to Sarah, his small frame trembling in fear. Greg's mind spun as he tried to come up with a plan. But the truth was, they were trapped. They couldn't stay in the basement forever, and they couldn't stay in the house. They needed to get out, and fast. But the question was, where could they go? And who could they trust in a world where everyone was either dead or infected? The answer hung in the air, thick with tension, as the sound of the infected grew ever closer. The air in the basement was thick with tension, every breath feeling heavier than the last. The barricade they'd created, a rickety assortment of tables, chairs, and anything they could find, wasn't much, but it was all they had. It creaked under pressure, groaning with every movement of the house. Greg could feel the walls closing in around them as the noise from above grew louder. The infected were getting closer, and the makeshift barrier wouldn't hold forever. Greg's mind raced. They had to leave the house. The walls were no longer a safe haven, the house was a prison, and the infected were already crawling through every corner. But where could they go? The streets were flooded with danger, and the outside world had become a wasteland of chaos. The stranger was now kneeling at the edge of the group, nervously glancing between the stairs and the barricade. His voice was low but urgent as he spoke again, almost pleading. Please, we can't stay here. There's a place nearby, an old warehouse. I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen it. It's secure, and it's been untouched so far. We'll be safer there. Greg locked eyes with the man, weighing his words carefully. The stranger's face was strained, and though there was fear in his eyes, there was also something else, something that resembled a deep, raw desperation. He was telling the truth. But that didn't mean he was trustworthy. No, Greg said, his voice firm. I don't trust you enough to take us there. Not yet. The stranger's face fell slightly, but he quickly recovered, a flicker of frustration flashing across his features. I'm trying to help you, he snapped, his voice rising. You'll die if you stay here. We'll all die if we don't move now. I'm not taking my family out there without a plan, Greg retorted, his grip tightening around the knife in his hand. His chest ached from the gash the creature had left earlier, but the adrenaline was enough to keep him moving. His family came first, and he wasn't going to gamble with their lives, not now. Greg, Sarah's voice was soft, hesitant. She was standing at his side, her eyes wide with worry as she placed a hand on his arm. We don't have much time. If we don't leave, we'll be trapped here with nowhere to go. Greg's eyes flicked to the door, where the sound of shuffling feet and guttural growls echoed through the house. His mind was racing, and he could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. They couldn't wait much longer. The infected were already outside the basement, and their barricade wouldn't hold them off forever. They needed to act now or risk being caught. All right, Greg said, finally relenting. We'll listen to you. But if you try anything at all, we won't hesitate to defend ourselves. The stranger nodded eagerly, his relief evident in the way his shoulders relaxed. I understand. I just want to make it out alive. We all do. Greg turned to Sarah, his eyes full of uncertainty. He hated this feeling, this constant sense of doubt that clawed at him. But he had no choice. They couldn't stay here. The house was too dangerous. Let's get the kids, Greg said, his voice steady. He turned to Emily and Ben, who were huddled in the corner, their faces pale with fear. You two stick close to me. We're leaving now. Emily looked up at her father, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but she nodded, gripping her metal rod tightly. Ben clung to Sarah's side, his small hands shaking. Greg motioned for the stranger to lead the way, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The air felt heavier as the sounds of the infected grew louder, the groans and snarls reverberating through the house. They didn't have much time. They needed to leave before the creatures found their way down into the basement. The stranger moved quickly, but Greg kept a firm grip on his knife, watching him closely. The man had promised to lead them to safety, but in this world, promises were hard to trust. They had to stick together, and they had to stay alert. The group moved cautiously toward the basement stairs, every step echoing through the silence of the house. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced over his shoulder. He could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, more infected, moving toward the stairs. Go, go, go! Greg hissed, urging them forward. He had no idea how much longer the barricade would hold, but there was no time to waste. They reached the stairs, and the stranger led them toward the back door. The once pristine hallway was now a mess of broken furniture, overturned lamps, and bloodstains. The house felt colder now, like a tomb. They moved quickly, silently, every footstep feeling like a death sentence as they approached the back door. Greg reached the door first, his hand on the handle. He paused for a moment, glancing out the window, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The street was overrun with the infected, some were mindlessly shuffling along, while others were sprinting with terrifying speed, their eyes locked on the house. They were surrounded. Move! Greg shouted, yanking the door open and ushering his family outside. They had no choice. The infected were everywhere, and the only chance they had was to get to the warehouse the stranger had mentioned. The air outside was thick with smoke, and the smell of burning wood lingered in the air. The streets were eerily quiet for a moment, but the distant growls told Greg that they wouldn't be alone for long. The group moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, as the stranger led them toward the warehouse. But even as they ran, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. The warehouse was their only hope, but how would they know it was any safer than the house they had just fled? What if it, too, was crawling with the infected? As they rounded a corner, Greg's mind flashed to his family's future. He had promised to protect them, but in this world, survival came with a price. Every choice, every step, could be their last. But there was no turning back now. The warehouse was close, and the sound of the infected's growls was getting louder. They had to reach it, before it was too late. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette barely visible against the smoke-choked sky. It seemed like a beacon of hope, a place of refuge in the middle of a nightmare. But as they sprinted toward it, Greg's mind remained clouded with doubt. The world had become unpredictable. Who could they trust? What if the stranger was leading them straight into the jaws of another danger? Every step felt like it could be their last. The sound of the infected's growls echoed closer, reverberating off the empty buildings that surrounded them. The streets were eerily silent except for the occasional shuffling of feet and the distant screams. The family ran through the desolate city, their hearts racing, their feet pounding against the cracked asphalt. They kept their heads low, staying out of sight as best they could. Greg's eyes were constantly scanning the surroundings. Every shadow seemed like a potential threat. Every noise sent his heart leaping into his throat. But it was Sarah's grip on his hand, her firm hold on their children, that kept him grounded. They couldn't let their guard down, not for a second. They were almost to the warehouse now. The large, rusted building appeared abandoned, its windows boarded up, its door locked with a heavy chain. Greg's mind raced as he approached the entrance. Would this place really be safe? Or was it yet another trap? The stranger, who had been leading them, stopped at the door, his face a mask of uncertainty. "This is it," he said, breathless, his voice trembling with fatigue and fear. "It's safe inside, I promise." Greg hesitated, eyeing the stranger warily. The man had been right so far, but that didn't mean he was out of danger. Greg couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut that something wasn't right. "Greg, we have no choice," Sarah whispered urgently, her face pale but determined. She turned to the kids, her voice softer, yet still carrying an edge of urgency. "Stay close to me, both of you." Greg nodded. He trusted his wife's instincts more than anyone's. They had to go in. They didn't have the luxury of time. The infected were closing in fast. "Help me with the door," Greg said to the stranger, his voice tight with resolve. The man nodded quickly, stepping forward to assist. Together, they worked to break the chain, their hands trembling with urgency. The sounds of the infected grew louder with every passing second, and Greg's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear their groans, feel their eyes following him. Finally, with a loud clank, the chain fell to the ground, and the heavy door creaked open. The stale air from inside the warehouse hit them like a wall, but it was a welcome change from the oppressive, stifling air outside. The stranger stepped into the darkness first, and Greg followed, ushering his family in behind him. The warehouse was cold and damp, with only the faintest sliver of light filtering in from the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Shelves filled with old, dusty supplies lined the walls, but the place felt hollow, lifeless. It was a safe place for now, but Greg couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't just outside. "Lock the door," Greg said to the stranger as he pushed his family deeper into the warehouse. The man complied, slamming the door shut and bolting it securely. They were safe, at least for the moment. But Greg knew it wouldn't last. The infected wouldn't stop. They'd find a way in eventually. The question was, how long would they be able to hold out? Greg took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "We need to make this place defensible," he said, looking around at the shelves and crates. "We don't know how long we'll be here. We need to prepare." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. "I'll help with the barricades. We need to find anything we can use." The children, though frightened, looked to their parents for reassurance. Emily held her metal rod tightly, as if it were a lifeline, while Ben clung to Sarah's side, his small hands gripping her sleeve. The stranger, now visibly exhausted, leaned against a stack of crates, catching his breath. "There's a small supply room in the back," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've seen it. We can search it for food and weapons." Greg glanced at him, weighing his words. They needed supplies, but they couldn't afford to be careless. "All right. Sarah, stay here with the kids." "I'll go with him." Sarah looked reluctant, but she nodded. "Be careful." Greg motioned for the stranger to lead the way. They moved deeper into the warehouse, their footsteps muffled by the cold concrete floor. The back of the building was as dark as the front, the shadows swallowing them whole as they made their way to the supply room. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with boxes of old equipment, ropes, flashlights, batteries, and tools. It wasn't much, but it was something. Greg scanned the room quickly, his eyes falling on a rusted crowbar in the corner. He grabbed it, feeling its weight in his hands. It would do. Is this all? Greg asked, glancing at the stranger, who was now rifling through a stack of crates. The stranger nodded. This is it. There's not much left, but there's enough to hold out for a while. We'll need to ration. Greg hesitated, his mind still reeling with questions. And the warehouse? How long do you think we'll be safe here? The stranger's face darkened. Not long. The infected are relentless. We can fortify this place, but they'll eventually find a way in. We'll need to move on, soon. Greg's stomach churned. He didn't want to think about that yet. They had only just found some semblance of safety. But the stranger's words rang true. They couldn't stay here forever. They returned to the main room, where Sarah and the kids had begun to organize their temporary refuge. The air felt heavier now, the weight of their reality pressing down on them. There were no guarantees. They had no idea how long they'd survive in this new world, if they would survive at all. But as Greg looked at his family, his wife, his children, he knew one thing: they weren't giving up. Not yet. Let's make this place ours, Greg said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. We'll hold them off. As long as we can. And for the first time since the outbreak began, Greg allowed himself a fleeting moment of hope. They were still alive. And for now, that was enough. The fight for survival would go on, but they would fight together.